So through the class, we've been talking about nutrition, exercise, and stress reduction thus far. This week, we want to look at social support, and next week, we're going to take a look at how sleep fits into the picture as well. So that's not listed on here, but should be. That's the last S. All right, so we've done nutrition, exercise, stress reduction. Here we're going to look at social support and social stressors as well. And then next week we'll talk about sleep. So let's remember just what we learned from the baboon study with Robert Sapolsky. So we learned that primates are super smart. They're organized just enough to devote their free time to being miserable and stressing each other out. But when you get chronically and psychosocially stressed, you compromise your health as well. So what Robert Sapolsky saw is that the baboons at the very top and the very bottom, especially the very bottom, had extra social stress and had higher cortisol levels. And the ones, especially at the very bottom, were the sickest ones that got ulcers and had immune compromised problems. The alpha males at the very top, even though they had extra stress, they could deal with that stress better because they also had that power structure. So baboons with the lower rank have the greatest amounts of stress and the diseases of stress. So their reproductive systems don't work as well. They're immune compromised. Their wounds don't heal as well. They're more slow. They have higher blood pressure, and they show more anxiety. The type A baboons, like we just said, also have more stress, especially when the troop isn't stable and they are being confronted a lot with challenges for that leadership position. So the type A baboons have to fight more, and they're constantly on the lookout for challenges. So they tend to suffer from things like high blood pressure and more cardiovascular disease. But they don't usually have the same immune compromised system as the low-ranking baboons have. Interestingly, the baboons that are in the middle that kind of fly under the radar, remember that they were grooming more with the females and they had more social connection within the troop. They also had a lot less stress because they weren't fighting. They're not lobbying for that leadership position of the type A alpha male. And so they actually are the healthiest in the troop. So when you have these social connections, you have better resilience, better immune system, lower stress levels, less cardiovascular disease. So the ultimate takeaway from the baboons is that social isolation is the worst for you, right? So the baboons that are down on the end of the spectrum, right, the lowest ranking baboons, they're not included in that social network that the middle baboons are. And so they don't have that same protection then from the stress related disease, and they have the worst health outcomes or prognoses. So what this shows us is that protection from stress related disease is most powerfully grounded in social connectedness. And that's far more important than rank within the troop. So the upper baboons and the lower baboons suffer more ill effects than the ones that are in the middle and have more of that social connection. So we also saw in the documentary on stress that autonomy and control are also very important within our lives. So the conditions in which you live and work are vital to your health as well, and how much control that you feel you have within those situations. So what do we know about early social stress in humans? Well, there are risk factors. So people that live in low socioeconomic status or in poverty have higher risk for early stress. If you've had any childhood sexual abuse or physical abuse, you're at higher risk for stress disease. Neglect and poor parental care is also an indicator or risk factor, or when children are separated from their parents. So if you have some of these risk factors, such as low socioeconomic status and poverty, if you have good parental care, this can offset some of those harshest stressors. So we can use the Dutch hunger winter as an example of how socioeconomic status and poverty can lead to higher risk outcomes. This was a time that occurred in Germany where the Germans actually blockaded any entry into Denmark. And so they blocked the transport of food and provisions and fuel. And they essentially starved these people during the winter, right, to make them give up during this war. So people that were born during this time were born to mothers that were essentially starving. They didn't get enough food to eat while they were pregnant. And then as children, they still did not get enough food to eat. So the children that were born during this time and have grown up and are now adults, they have increased risk of things like cardiovascular disease. They have increased hypercholesteremia, and they have increased risk for obesity and diabetes. So this is independent of genetic markers for disease states. So this shows that the situation that you come into in life, right, also, or the environment, also has a big effect on your health outcomes. And so this is nothing that these people have done during their lifetimes to increase their risk. This is just what they were born into and exposed to while they were in their mother's uterus, while they were still developing during pregnancy, and beyond that. So factors that are beyond your control can happen that lead to increased risk of disease. So this is one key takeaway then, that factors within the environment that you're exposed to, even in utero when your mom is still pregnant, can have dramatic effects on the duration of your life. There was also a study that's called Mary Ainsworth's Maternal Sensitivity Scale, and this looks at 4 dimensions of responsiveness that parents have to their infant. So there's 4 areas. The first one is in sensitivity versus insensitivity. So how sensitively do they respond to their child? The acceptance or rejection. So you've got a scale there. Availability or neglect by the parents. And then cooperation and interference by the parents and the child. So sensitive parents respond promptly, they're empathetic towards their infants, and they're more available or less rejecting and more cooperative with the infant, right? So they come when they cry and things like that. So if people are on the lower part of this scale and moving more towards the insensitivity, rejection, neglect, or interference with the child, these lower MS scores, if they're observable early, they become linked with failure to thrive. The children can have growth abnormalities, cardiovascular irregularities, and inflammatory diseases in childhood. So I want to note that these are severe, right? So it doesn't mean that if you have one bout where you were insensitive to your child, that your child's going to end up, having these abnormalities. But if they are continuously and constantly exposed to these environments, then this leads to greater risk. The same thing with the Dutch hunger winter. This was an extreme situation, right, where these people were physically starving and going through pregnancy under starvation conditions. This isn't just a mild going without food for one morning or one breakfast. This is continuously suffering from starvation. Okay, so these are extreme situations. So the mother-child relationships that had the higher MS scores, the children were healthier, more socially and cognitively developed than the children from the lower MS score families. They have higher academic success, and as adults, they have a higher sense of security, a lower propensity for things like depression and anxiety, and lower risk for obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. So parental input and parental care is very important. So I want to shift and talk a little bit about a phenomena that happens over our lifetimes and that can be also influenced by the amount of stress that can speed up this process. So, within each of our cells, we have our DNA that carries our genes on there. So, all of our traits within the human body are carried in the DNA. And when they get expressed, that's when we get the proteins produced. And the proteins have different effects in our body that give us the traits that we have. Things like high blood pressure or cardiovascular disease risk, that's going to be given by what genes are expressed or what genes are not expressed at the correct times. Right? So our chromosomes are the structures that are formed by the DNA. So the DNA is carried on our chromosomes, and every time a cell has to divide, it has to replicate that DNA and copy it so that it is in both copies of the cell. So that's shown down here. You've got one cell dividing into two cells, and this DNA has to be replicated. And so this actually, when it's in the X form, it is in the replicated form. And then when the cell separates, it's going to pull apart the X into long linear strands and separate them into the daughter cells. So what you'll notice is on the ends of this chromosome, right, there are some darkened patches down here. These regions of the chromosome are called the telomere regions. And what happens every time you replicate your DNA, the enzymes that do this process can't fully replicate the ends of the chromosome, right? So every time you have to replicate the DNA to make a new cell, the telomeres will get shorter and shorter over your lifespan. So that's one of the thoughts of why we age and why we can't live forever, is that the telomeres keep shortening on the chromosomes and the DNA gets shorter and shorter after each round. So these telomere structures are repeat sequences, like maybe 4-base repeats, like ATCG over and over and over again. So there's no genes in this region of the chromosome. And so the shortening of this is all right until you get through the full telomere. And then you get into more of the DNA structure that can be whittled away. Right? So having longer telomeres is going to give you a greater protection over your lifetime to stressors and give you a longer period of time where you can replicate cells successfully. So these telomeres then are repeat sequences. They're cap-like features at the ends of the chromosomes that help protect them when the cell divides. Okay, and as we age, they naturally get shorter and shorter. So there's been hypotheses that maybe stressful events or things that we do to ourselves during our lifetimes will shorten telomeres inappropriately so that you have greater propensity to get to the end of the chromosomal life earlier than if you hadn't had those stresses. So they looked at that for people that had gone through the Dutch hunger winter and had been born during that time. However, what they found is that there was no correlation of telomere length with the experience of famine during gestation. So the people that had been born during the Dutch hunger winter did not have shortened telomere length. So this cohort study had 131 individuals born between 1943 and 46. So they had 45 people that were born before the famine, so kind of normal times. 41 people that were exposed to the famine during gestation, that was like 1944. And then 45 conceived after the famine had happened that they were examining. And they didn't really see any difference in the telomere length between these people. However, they were able to correlate telomere length with other stress risk factors. So socioeconomic status was associated with telomere length. So the subjects whose fathers were manual workers compared with lower to upper middle class occupations had significantly shorter telomeres. That's interesting. So remember, we said that poverty and socioeconomic status, when it's low, can have higher risk factors for stress and diseases of stress. And it also is associated with shorter telomere length. They also found that shorter telomere length was associated with higher alcohol consumption. So People that had frequent consumption of alcohol, especially of the harder alcohol like bourbon and whiskey, had shorter telomere length. If they had a history of cancer diagnosis, there was also shorter telomere length and self reported health. So, if people reported that they didn't have very good health, that they were sick a lot, that they didn't feel well quite a bit, that was also a risk factor for having shorter telomere length. So, this is interesting because it says that some of the environmental factors that we are exposed to, either by no choice of our own or by some of our choice, can cause shortening of telomeres. So there's also been some studies on the Mediterranean diet that we talked about last week, and noting that people that adhere to these diets that are high in plant-based materials and in seeds and nuts, like, also have longer telomere length. And we will also see that many of our blue zones, when we talk about the blue zones next week, we will see that people in those blue zones have these higher diets and likely have longer telomere lengths. So, correlating that with the health span or lifespan. Although these are quite difficult studies to conduct, and so you should approach these critically and note that these are correlated right now, but not necessarily causative for disease states. While telomere length is correlated with some of the different features that cause higher stress, such as socioeconomic status, alcohol consumption, and longer telomere length is associated with positively correlated things like the Mediterranean diet or higher plant-based diet. We still need to take this with a grain of salt, right? That these are correlations at this time, and we don't have a complete mechanism for why the increased risk happens, but that this is just a marker. So this could be something that's happening along with that other stress. It may not be causative, and so we have to be careful using it as a marker for health span or lifespan, or for our thoughts about whether people are at higher risk for disease states. So you wouldn't want people just to go in and look at their telomere length and get freaked out, if they had lower telomere length, because we just don't have enough data yet within the normal population to see the range and variability of telomere length and know what that means. So these types of studies, while they're very interesting, I think you have to be careful when you're trying to correlate that with overall health. Okay, but we do have a couple more studies to talk about. So we know that caregivers that are under chronic stress, so if you're caring for a family member that has a disease like cancer, or if you're caring for a child that has a disease, that these people are under a lot more chronic stress, and they show signs of chronic stress. They have reduced wound healing, so they are often immune compromised. It can take up to 24% longer for wounds to heal in this population. They can have impaired vaccine response, again indicating that their immune system is not functioning properly. And they have overall increased inflammation within the body, and they also have correlations with shorter telomere length. So the main conclusion here is that chronic caregiving leads to accelerated aging processes. So people that are in this type of situation where you have to be a chronic caregiver, I think they need to have some time for themselves as well. It's very important that they are not totally burnt out by their caregiving duties. They need to have breaks. They need to be able to rejuvenate and revitalize themselves to be able to give back to the others that in their lives that need their care. And that often gets pushed aside when you're in that chronic caregiving position. So, how do we handle stress? How do we make time for building this resilience inside ourselves? Well, we've already actually seen quite a few things in our lives that can help with this. First, we've taken a look at exercise. Exercise is really important for stress reduction, right? We've looked a little bit at things like forest bathing that put us into a mindful state. So, mindfulness is really our presence, right? Being present in the moment can be very useful for reducing stress. Trying some deep breathing exercises, taking a walk in nature, doing some of that forest bathing to kind of reset our processes so that we are feeling present in the moment and not thinking about the future or the past, right? You're just enjoying some of the features in nature, listening to the birds, looking at the plants that are growing, or maybe if it's winter time, looking at the snow on the ground or hearing the sound of a storm and just absorbing all of that that's happening in the now rather than being in the future or the past and bringing that worry into your life. So, mindfulness and being present is very important. And when you can do things that put you in a mindful state and bring you back to that present moment, these things are going to be very helpful. So, meditation also falls in that mindfulness state, right? So, meditate. We'll do some meditative exercises next week, and these might kind of surprise you. There is kind of traditional meditation where you're sitting quietly and trying to focus on your breath and things like that. That can be very difficult for people. The mind tends to wander a lot, and bringing it back into that still place and focusing on the breath can be hard. So, for some people, that type of meditation works really well, but for others, it can be very difficult. I find that kind of meditation to be very difficult. I have problems bringing my intention back to that current moment. So, I like other forms of meditation. My favorite one is Tai Chi. That's often called meditation in motion. And I can get into a flow state while doing Tai Chi that brings me back to that very present moment where I'm not thinking about anything really. I'm just doing Tai Chi and being present there in that moment. So if you have activities can put you in a meditative state as well and put you into that flow state. I think for some people, doing things like knitting would be another example of where you could be very present and meditative. So you could be very focused on that one thing that you're actually doing. So there's lots of ways to meditate. You can also have focused meditation on specific problems maybe that you're having and thinking about that in certain ways, like how will I think about this problem in 5 years? What will this mean to me? And trying to put yourself into the future, or trying to say, if I had a friend that was in this situation, what kind of advice would I give that friend? Trying to reframe your position with that problem. That can also be a very helpful meditative way to try to address that problem. And then there's also meditative states for things like gratitude. So maybe you're focusing on the positive things in your life that you're grateful for. So that would be another type of meditation. So meditation comes in many, many packages, and how you do it can vary from person to person. So it really is a wide variety of things. And so hopefully you can find some meditative practices that work with you and can be helpful. We also saw with Amy Cuddy that body language and stance can be very influential about our mood. So if we're smiling a lot, like that can actually make us feel happy. Even if we weren't smiling because we were happy, if we were forcing the smile or our mouth to go into a smile, that can actually make a mood change for us. So, having the victory pose or the Wonder Woman pose can also make us feel confident before we go into a stressful situation. So, remember, body language and stance can play a big role as well. And then our mindset, trying to change our mindset from changing the stressful event in our life into a challenge when we can. Some stressors are too big to do that, but when we can change, like maybe test anxiety more into a challenge mindset or a growth mindset, this can help reduce that stress and make it a more positive thing in your life. So we have seen that choices, things like alcohol consumption and also smoking, can have a big effect on how we handle stress. And other times, life circumstances outside of our control can also affect our ability to handle stress. And so sometimes we need to reach out and get extra support or extra help to handle very difficult situations. Interestingly, your education level and life quality are correlated with each other in a positive way as well. So there are additional benefits to earning a college degree than increasing your socioeconomic status. Although we've seen socioeconomic status is correlated with your stress level and your overall health. So good health is one of those benefits of earning a college degree. First, you're taking classes like this one where you're learning about healthy strategies for life. This is a requirement at our university. And so that can contribute to how you're living, right? So college graduates are 44% healthier than their non graduate peers. They tend to develop healthier habits. They have occupations with healthier working conditions. This is partly because you're choosing your occupation when you come to college. You get to try on different things and see what fits with you and what you want to do in your life rather than having to take a job because you're more lowly qualified and don't qualify for a lot of different positions. People who have college educations also typically have better access to healthcare, right? So you can go in when you have a problem and get it taken care of versus people that don't have as good a health care and tend not to go into the doctor earlier when they're having a problem. They wait and wait until it gets really serious. People that have gone to college are less likely to smoke. They're more likely to wear a seatbelt. They're more likely to exercise, see a doctor regularly, and volunteer. Interestingly, volunteering is very positively correlated with mood. It provides purpose and it provides meaning and it makes you feel happier to be able to give to other people. So, this last benefit as well, people that have gone to college are more likely to live longer. So, very interesting things for education. In addition, people that have earned a college degree are more likely to see the glass as half full. They're more likely to be optimistic. They have a greater sense of personal well being and life satisfaction. They typically have jobs that they have chosen and that they want to be at. They want to wake up and go to every day. So they have better job satisfaction. And these things bring more sense of happiness into their life. They also set a positive role model and example for their children. So, children whose parents attended college are much more likely to attend university and graduate themselves. So, they can pass on these positive benefits of education within their family. Education also tends to expand your worldview. So, college graduates are better able to apply what they've learned into real world situations, and they tend to be more accepting of other cultures and other peoples around the world. They also tend to have stronger relationships. College graduates seek to build a mutually fulfilling marriage, and they strive to pursue family stability compared with high school graduates. And we're going to see that stronger relationships and our social connections are critically important for health span. In fact, they are the biggest indicator of health span. So, again, reminding us of our baboon study, the males that are in the middle road in rank spend most of their time grooming, And this social connection within the troop leads them to having lower cortisol levels than the males that are on the top, and certainly the males that are on the bottom that have the highest cortisol levels. People who feel isolated within society are at higher risk for poor mental health, poor cardiovascular health, higher feelings of stress, and reduced immune system response. So, all of the things that a stressful environment will give us. So, there was a study called the Psychological Stress and Susceptibility to the Common Cold that was done. And this one was done before COVID. I don't know that it would be done at the current time. But what they did is they evaluated people for their psychological stress. They did this through some surveys, right, to figure out what was stressful in their life. Had they recently lost somebody important to them? Were they undergoing a very stressful time? And how they ranked themselves as far as their stress. And then they put them up at a hotel for a couple of weeks and they gave them nasal drops containing one of 5 respiratory viruses. So you can see the rhinovirus, different types. These cause the common cold, respiratory syncytial virus, RSV. We've heard a lot about RSV recently and the dangers of this. And they also used a coronavirus type 229E. So coronaviruses are also very common within our society. They have been for a long time. And you can see this study was from 1991. So these things are just out there and cause the common cold. The COVID virus is a strain of coronavirus that causes more severe disease. And I think the RSV virus that is currently circulating right now is also has heightened risk for people that get it. So this study likely would not have passed muster today, but this one was done in 1991. And in this study, 26 were just given saline nasal drops. So that's their control group. Right? The subjects were then quarantined for the couple of weeks. So they were put up in a hotel and they were monitored then for evidence of infection and symptoms. So clinical colds were defined as clinical symptoms in the presence of an infection that's verified by the isolation of the virus or by an increase in the virus-specific antibody titer, right? So people can have a cold, right, and show cold symptoms like runny nose, fever, chills, this type of things. These are the clinical symptoms, right? But you can also have the presence of an infection without symptoms, right? We know COVID can cause that. There's a lot of people that get infected but don't have any symptoms, right? So to tell if they're infected, they look for the virus inside the body, right? So, or antibodies against the virus, right? To show that you have had an actual infection. So they did both of these things in this study, right? So just an outtake before we see the results, talking about the human coronavirus types. Coronaviruses are named for the crown-like spikes on their surface, and I'm sure that people have seen pictures of COVID, right, with the little spiky ball pictures that you see on YouTube and things when you're looking up information about COVID, right? Well, coronaviruses are divided into 4 different major groups: the alpha, the beta, the gamma, and the delta groups. And they were first identified in the mid-1960s. So 7 coronavirus types can infect people. So common types of coronaviruses are the 229E, the alpha coronavirus, NL63, which is also an alpha coronavirus, 2 beta coronaviruses, OC43 and HKU1. And then these other 3 have higher mortality rates associated with them. The MERS and the first SARS-CoV, which are beta coronaviruses that cause severe acute respiratory syndrome, and SARS-CoV-2, the latest COVID outbreak, is a novel coronavirus that has caused this most recent pandemic. So it's notable that people around the world commonly get infected with these top four, and these top four typically cause a common cold. So, when these types of viruses can also infect animals, in the animal host, they can evolve and then they can jump back from the animal species back into people, and they can make people sicker and become new human coronaviruses. And so we think that that's the case for all three of these. The MERS-CoV was associated with camels, and both of the SARS-CoV viruses associated with bats, and also pangolins potentially for the current COVID virus, SARS-CoV-2. So, back to our study where they actually gave people exposure to these different viruses and correlated that with their psychological stress. So, people that had higher psychological stress, gauged on this index from the survey that they took, you can see that the clinical cold symptoms actually also went up directly with that line, also went up with how much stress they indicated that they had. So, and you can see that the actual viral infections as well went up with psychological stress. And this makes sense because we know that stress will decrease immune system functions. So it's likely that the people down here with lower stress levels had heightened immune response so that when they were exposed to the different viruses, they were able to fight them off straight away, and they didn't become sick or have as many clinical cold symptoms. They maybe had a milder infection. So it's important to note that low stress doesn't mean no colds, right? It just means lower symptomology and probably less time being sick. So that when you have high psychosocial stress, you have an increase in your risk for developing sickness from an exposure. And that's dependent on the type of virus that you're exposed to. So the coronaviruses overall caused more incidence of illness than exposure to the other virus types. So you can see some viruses are not very infective and don't cause a big response, while others make you feel quite sick. So, what exactly are the benefits then of social connectedness in improving our health outcomes? Social connectedness has been shown to improve our ability to cope with stressful situations. It helps alleviate the effects of emotional distress, and this helps us promote better health because we can reduce the overall effects of that stress, right? So that's going to promote lifelong good mental health to have strong social connections. It enhances self esteem, and people that have good social connectedness have lower risk for cardiovascular disease and lower blood pressure overall. It also can help to promote healthy lifestyle behaviors when you have social connectedness that will help bring that into your life or reinforce those behaviors. And when you have good social connections, it will encourage you to adhere to treatment plans if you have an illness, right? You've got somebody there making sure you're taking your medicine and you're feeling better over time. So Harvard did this study, and it's almost 80 years in the running now where they've been following cohorts of people to see how long they live and what life factors are correlated with that. So they've tried to measure everything in their lives. They send out huge packets to the participants every year, and the participants also come in every year and they give blood samples so that they have markers for things like cardiovascular health, they have their lipid profile and their risk for things like diabetes and metabolic disorders and all of these things. What they overall found, one of the key takeaways from this study, is that good genes are nice, but joy is better. Now, that is fantastic outcome, right? The more joyful that you can be in your life and sharing that joy with other people is a better indicator for your overall health and longevity than your genes. So that's fantastic. So we can do a lot within our lives to help ourselves live longer. So what this study has shown is that embracing community helps us live longer and be happier. So in this study, they began tracking 268 Harvard sophomore men. Of course, they started with men. They didn't have any women in the study for quite a long time, but now they do have women that they're following as well. But this started in 1938 during the Great Depression, and they were hoping that this longitudinal study would reveal clues to leading healthy and happy lives. So this was their first group. The second group, they expanded this study to include the tracking of a group of boys from the poorest areas of Boston, right? So they were looking to see how socioeconomic status also affected health and happiness over time. So, what is their surprising finding is that our relationships and how happy we are in our relationships has a very powerful influence on our health. So, what they found is that taking care of your body is important, so exercise and eating right, but tending to your relationships is a form of self care too. And that was the key revelation in this study, that our social connections are super important. So, how do we create a social network so that we can have this type of support and bring joy and happiness into our lives? So, the foundation of social network says that building these types of relationships is really a give and take. You need to stay in touch, answer your phone calls, return emails, and reciprocate invitations. This lets people know that you care about them. Don't compete. Be happy instead of jealous when your friends succeed and be their champions. They will in turn be your champions when you succeed and do something in your life. Try to be a good listener. Listen when your friends are speaking and find out what's important to them. They'll listen to you in return. And try not to overdo it. Be careful to not overwhelm friends and family with phone calls and emails. Save those high demand times for when you really need them. Appreciate your friends and family. Take time to say thank you and express how important they are to you. And try to give back. Be available for family and friends when they need your support. All right, and I'm going to end this week by just giving a brief introduction to the Centenarian Project, or the Blue Zones, and we are going to talk about this in more depth next week. But there's several places in the world where people will live very long lives, up to 100 or older in some cases. So these are the Centenarian zones, centa meaning 100, right? And these are called the Blue Zones. Places like Icaria in Greece, Loma Linda in California, and Sardinia in Italy. And so we're going to take a tour of these centenarian zones and find out what these different cultures and communities are like, and why are people there living so long. Is there a genetic component, food component, exercise component? What are they doing? And social component. All right, so that is it for this week.